Our next speaker is Sebastien Gagneaux. He's the Associate Professor of Infectious Biology and Head of the Department of Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute. Sebastien.
Good morning, everyone, and let me start by thanking the organizers for this invitation. My group is not working on drugs or diagnostics. We're primarily interested in the evolution of Mycobacterium. That it's a key, discipline to understand and predict what's going to happen in the future with the TB epidemic, in particular as far as obviously drug resistance is concerned. And we heard a lot of discussions and presentations, exciting developments about new drug regimens coming up, and obviously, and somebody asked the question, what are you going to do to prevent the emergence of resistance in the future? And I would argue that understanding how these bacteria evolve and develop resistance within patients and then also transmit between patients is a key aspect that we need to understand. Now, Marco asked me to talk about acquired resistance to new drugs. And I really just got it. So we have primary linezolid resistance already circulating somewhere, together with all these other resistance mutations. I'm also less transmissible. And even though it is esoteric, perhaps, 15 years ago when I started to work in tuberculosis, this dogma, say don't waste money to treat multi-drug resistant patients because they will not transmit. They might die, but it's not really a public health problem. From that point of view,